Hey all, welcome to the lab on plants. Today we're going to be discussing all the different kinds of plants and what makes them different. And so remember that plants are autotrophs, and this is a group of organisms that makes their own food. They generate energy from the sun and they use that to drive their metabolic systems. So plants are made up of three main tissues. You have ground tissues, dermal tissues, and vascular tissues. So dermal tissues include the epidermis and things that protect the plant from the drier outside world. Those also include things like guard cells, which we will discuss when we look at different plant models. Vascular tissues include a lot of different tissues that move substances or nutrients throughout the bodies of the plants. Those kinds of tissues can assist the plant in growing much larger and also help the plant growing in places that might be too dry otherwise. What's left is ground tissues, and those are basically any tissues that aren't vascular tissues or epidermal tissues. So we're going to divide plants into several different categories, and that first division of two different main categories is going to be vascular plants and non-vascular plants. Now, vascular plants have vascular tissues, which include xylem and phloem. Phloem carries nutrients like sugar down, and that's a byproduct from photosynthesis, down towards the roots or out towards places that require it for growth, like fruits or leaf tips and things like that. Now, xylem is the other tissue, and that carries water up from the ground to the leaf tips wherever water is needed throughout the plant. Not all plants have vascular tissue, so non-vascular plants, including things like this moss here, don't have those vascular tissues. So they can't carry water up and they can't bring products down, so that really limits their size. And this is a moss right here, which is a kind of bryophyte. Bryophytes are limited because of that, and so they're pretty much dependent on very moist environments nearby water, or they can only grow during periods of high moisture, like rain events. Plants that have vascular tissue, like this plant right here, are able to generate these woody stems and stronger structures that can protect them from their drier environments and also allow them to grow much bigger. So you can see just this one piece of this tree is orders of magnitude bigger than this whole little clump of moss.
So there are also many plants that have seeds and many plants that don't make seeds. Mosses, which we just talked about, do not make seeds, but they don't have vasculature either. Plants like ferns do have vascular tissue, so they can get much larger than mosses can. Ferns, though, do not have seeds, unlike angiosperms and gymnosperms. They instead produce other smaller plants using these spores that you can find on the undersides of their leaves if you've ever been hiking. Angiosperms and gymnosperms make spores too, but you can't see them as easily as you can see these ones. The next division in the groups of plants we're going to talk about are plants that make flowers, which we call angiosperms, and plants which don't make flowers, which we call gymnosperms. Examples of gymnosperms are pines, like this one, and examples of angiosperms are lilies, like this one. So plants that make flowers also will make fruits. You may or may not know this, but the portion of the flower that has eggs inside of it, when those are fertilized, they become seeds. So anything you've ever eaten that has seeds inside is an angiosperm. That fruit came from a flower. Plants that don't make flowers often instead make cones. You've probably seen the big pine cones that you might see when you go for walks in Redwood or Briones parks, but cone plants also make pollen cones. So all these cones you see here are pollen cones, and they're making the pollen for the plant, which is something we'll talk about a bit later. Within the group that we call angiosperms, which are flowering plants, there are smaller subgroups. One of those groups is what we would call monocots, and one of those groups is something we would call dicots. Most monocots have petals in sets of 3, which is what you see in this lily. We've got 3 petals here. And dicots usually have petals in sets of 4 or 5. So here we can see 5.
Another difference between monocots and dicots is the way that the veins run through the leaves. On dicots, they'll have these netted structure, and they can look a little bit like branched veins. Monocots, on the other hand, have parallel leaf veins. So you can see on this example, the leaf veins are running alongside each other and go from the base to the tip. And now you can already kind of make some guesses as to what groups of plants are monocots and which might be dicots. So this is a monocot because it has those parallel veins, and this is a lily. Other familiar monocots include things like grasses, bamboo, palm trees, and a lot of important food sources like corn and wheat. Another difference between monocots and dicots is the way their vascular tissues bundle up and the way they form woody tissues. So I'm here at DVC campus and I'm in line for an unopened coffee shop, but here you can see cross sections of a dicot. And this is pretty typical of dicots where you have rings, and you're probably familiar with aging plants by their rings. Well, that's really only possible in dicot wood. But what would a tree look like, or what would a palm tree look like? I just said those are monocots. What would a palm tree look like if you cut it? So here we have a palm tree that has been cut in half, and it's about the same diameter as that dicot cross section. But on this palm tree, you don't really see those rings in the middle. You just see this pith and kind of an unorganized distribution of vascular tissue.